Hi, welcome to today's video. My name is Paul. Today we're going to be doing this sort of impressionist loose watercolor landscape that you can see on the right hand side of the screen. Okay, so the paint that I'm using is Sennelier watercolor paint, and I use the tubes. You can also get this in the form of pans, little flat blocks of paint, usually sit in plastic pallets. Instead I use tubes, and I just have a large plastic palette, and when I start painting I just squeeze out whatever paint I need. You can see with the blue paint there, it's quite liquid. Some of the Sennelier colors are more like that. They mix honey in with their watercolor paint, and sometimes it can be quite runny. For brushes, I just use a mop brush. You can see on the left there's also a Hake brush, slightly bigger brush, but for this painting I'm just using a mop brush. And then this is the paper that I use. I'm never sure how to pronounce this, Arche paper. Anyway, it's quite a well-known watercolor paper, and I use the cold pressed version. With watercolor paper you can often get it in different varieties. Cold press and hot pressed are the two main ones. So the cold pressed has a rougher surface, and then the hot pressed has a very smooth surface. For this type of loose watercolor painting, I definitely recommend getting a cold pressed or rough paper. Then I just use a bit of masking tape to tape the paper down onto a board. Now, before putting any pigment onto the paper, I just soak the paper with clean water. You notice I didn't do any drawing on the paper. It's just a blank piece of paper. If I were doing a cityscape or something that had a lot of figures, or even just one or two figures in it, I probably would do a pencil sketch, at least a rough pencil sketch first. But with landscapes where there's no people and no buildings, I don't do any pencil sketches underneath. I think it helps to keep the painting looser. So then for the sky, I have three blues. I have a dark, medium, and a light blue. So I think the dark blue was Prussian blue. Then the medium blue was cerulean. And I have a third blue, I can't remember the name, but it's a kind of a turquoisey blue. You don't need to use the colors or the brands of paint that I'm using. You should definitely try experimenting, find out what you like to use. At this point, this is the first mistake that I made in this painting. This line that I've put across is going to be sort of the horizon. These are hedges at the end of a field, but the line is much too dark. And the thing about watercolor is, once you put down the paint and it starts to seep into the paper, there isn't much you can do. It's not like oil paint where you can scrape it back. Or even acrylic. Okay, acrylic dries very quickly, but even with acrylic you have a chance to scrape back something or paint over the top of it. You can't even paint over the top of it very well with watercolor, because watercolor is quite translucent. So if you try to put a light color on top of a dark color, the darker color will just show through. That's why watercolors are usually painted in layers, at least 2 layers. So on the first layer, usually you're putting down lighter colors, and then you put darker details on top of that. The first layer is not so much about details, it's just getting in the big masses, so the sky, bushes, trees, things like that. Okay, so at this point I start adding in some other colors. Up to now I've just been using basically greys and blues. You can mix colors either on your palette, and I use that plastic palette, or you can mix on the paper to some extent, especially if you're using lots of water on the paper. To define some of these larger masses, I use less water and more pigment. This brush that I'm using is natural hair. It's squirrel hair. Now, some people don't like using brushes with natural hair, and you can get, these days you can get synthetic hair watercolor brushes. They're not exactly the same. There's two main differences, at least from my point of view. So first of all, the synthetic brushes don't hold as much water as the natural hair brushes do. So that can be a problem. It depends on your style of painting, how much water you use with your watercolors. The second problem, which is more of a problem for me, is synthetic brushes, if you bend the bristles back, they immediately bounce back to their original position. They're quite flexible in that way, and they hold the shape of the brush. Whereas natural hair brushes don't do that. If you bend the bristles back or you spread them out, they'll stay spread out, at least until you dip the brush into the water and reform the head of the bristles. But the advantage of the natural hair brushes then is you can, with a drier brush, you can spread the bristles out and you can create different effects with that. You can, using less water on the brush and more pigment, you can create an impression of blades of grass, for example, or branches on a tree. It's much more difficult, if not impossible, to do that with the synthetic brushes. At least that's what I've found. So when you're looking at this, you can see that the bristles sometimes are quite spread out on the brush. It also allows me to do this sort of dabbing effect where you're putting on small dabs of pure pigment, and it can create an impression of leaves or flowers on grass and things like that. Note also that when I'm putting the colors down at this stage, I'm not putting down large flat areas of color. It's all dabs and small patches, and there's a very good reason for that. Because we're painting a field, it needs to be broken up. If it's too regular, it'll start to look more like a manicured lawn rather than a field. It also, when you break it up and you have irregular patches, it's much more interesting to look at. So the end result looks much better. So you remember I said in the first layer it was all about putting down the big masses like the sky and the bushes, trees, things like that. Then once you've let the paper completely dry, you can start the second layer and start putting on little dabs. The second layer is more about details. Now with the impressionist style painting, we're not really doing actual details, we're doing implied details. So like I say, little dabs of pure color, they can suggest blades of grass, they can suggest leaves on the trees and the bushes, rather than actually painting in actual leaves and blades of grass and so on. Impressionism is just that, it's an impression. It's not, the focus of Impressionism is not detail, it's not photorealism. Now at the moment I'm using white. This isn't actually watercolor, this is gouache. And gouache is very similar to watercolor. It is water soluble, but it's a sort of a chalky pigment, which means it's not translucent. It's quite opaque. So you can put, say, pure white on top of dark colors with gouache that you couldn't do with watercolors. In fact, watercolors don't really use white. If you want to have white, for example, clouds in the sky, very often what you'll do is just not put any pigment onto that part of the paper. And that's where skill with using water with your watercolor can be very useful when it comes to trying to paint the sky. All of that sort of technical stuff, how much water to use, how much pigment to put on the brush, that just comes with practice. Remember, when you're first starting out, your first attempts, they could be okay, or you may not be completely pleased with the first results. It doesn't matter. You keep going, you keep practicing, you try and fix the problems one at a time. People sometimes talk about developing their style of painting, and that's part of the process of developing your own style, is solving the problems, making things look the way you want them to look. And that just takes time and practice. So again, you can see it's just tiny little dabs of paint at this stage. And there's not really much water going on the brush. The brush is quite dry. Now, as I've said before in other videos, at this point you have to start to decide when enough is enough. It is possible to overwork paintings. So you can have something that you think, well, this looks good, and then you keep adding a bit more and a bit more, and then you look at it again and you think, I've ruined this painting. Something happened to it, and you've overworked the painting. So at some point you just have to say, right, the painting is now finished, and put the brush down and step away. And it sounds easy, but actually it can be quite difficult to know when to stop. I should say, at this point I added in a few little drops of blue paint. If you look at a lot of Impressionist painting, they don't really use black. They use blues or deep violets to suggest shadow and give the painting some feeling of depth. So try and avoid blacks. Black is very overpowering. Both black and white tend to overpower every other color on the paper. So use them sparingly. Okay, so that's the end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully some use to and inspire you to go on try and create some Impressionist watercolor painting. It's great fun. If you would like to subscribe to my channel, I try to put out videos on a regular basis, all you have to do is click on the big red button below to subscribe. And the bell icon beside that, if you click on that, it allows you to, it'll inform you when I've uploaded a new video.